Hello class, today we are talking about medical ethics and the trolley problem with Gabriel Andrade. Andrade teaches out of St. Matthew's University at the Cayman Islands. And so this paper was written in 2019 by Andrade, and we are looking again at bioethics and more specifically medical ethics. And when we are thinking about medical ethics, Andrade introduces us to Beauchamp and Childress's principles of medical ethics, and he focuses on the principle of non-maleficence. But Beauchamp and Childress had 4 principles of bioethics that medical professionals are to follow. So the first one has to do with autonomy, the second one with beneficence. In other words, you're to honor a patient's autonomy, you're to be beneficent in your care, and then you're also to observe non-maleficence, in other words, causing no harm, and then also you are to help patients in terms of justice. And he is focusing on non-maleficence. And so it's commonly understood that non-maleficence is an important rule, and we see that with regard to the Hippocratic Oath, in other words, abstain from doing no harm. And so abstain from doing no harm is another way of considering the ethical principle of non-maleficence. And so for example, if a patient is in extreme pain and asks her doctor to prescribe a large dose of morphine for her pain, the doctor must favor non-maleficence above and beyond patient's autonomy, due to the fact that the morphine is dangerous and with a huge potential for addiction, and likewise the doctor is likely to favor beneficence. And so we might think of the old adage, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. In other words, if newer biotechnologies also sound promising and beneficial, the consequences are not always, and the consequences are not completely known. In fact, may bring about more long-term harm. And so the key is to aim for the beneficence of the doctor, or the doctor is to aim for more beneficence, especially as we are looking at the progress of biotechnology, so on and so forth. And so justice may also collide with non-maleficence, and Andrade asks us to consider the philosopher Philippa Foot. Philippa Foot was born in 1920 and passes away in 2010, and she is the developer of the famous thought experiment known as the trolley problem. But she also had this scenario whereby surgeons have 5 patients that are in need of transplants who will die of organs, and a young, so actually let me back up a little bit. Let's also point out that throughout the essay, Andrade is making use of what we refer to in philosophy as thought experiments. And so a thought experiment is basically a hypothetical situation that a philosopher develops in order to consider the ramifications and issues, problems, etc., with a philosophical position, so otherwise known as a thought experiment. So Philippa Foot's famous thought experiment, whereby a surgeon has 5 patients waiting for transplants and will die if the organs are not found. So in other words, they're terminally ill and they're in need of organ transplantation. So a young traveler from out of town drops into the doctor's office for a routine checkup, and the doctor quickly surmises that the patient's organs are just the right fit for his 5 ailing patients. And so the question is, should the doctor harvest the organs from the young person or not? And the answer is, of course not. And so in this example, Andrade takes us to the conclusion that justice in this case would not override non-maleficence. And so, yet is it that we justify this ethical philosophy and this core principle of doing no harm? So Andrade is seeking to critique this notion of doing no harm. So what we're looking at is this problem of non-maleficence for healthcare professionals. And so the main theme throughout the essay that we want to get a hold of is calling into question non-maleficence. So he's seeking to critique the notion that non-maleficence should always, in all cases, be observed. So now we have the first trolley, the first so-called trolley problem. And so as Andrade highlights, the trolley problem is a thought experiment whereby we are testing our ethical intuition out with the case of out-of-control trolleys with numbers of people tied to tracks. And there's always the old slapstick, cartoonish, dark humor that's brought about and emphasized with the ethical decisions to sacrifice the lives of others at the expense of the few. And this is also to highlight problems with regard to utilitarian ethics. And so one thing that we also need to consider is that Andrade is a utilitarian, and in this sense, he's also looking at problems and ways to call into question issues of non-maleficence, to also then highlight problems or issues in terms of intuitions with regard to utilitarianism. And I'm going to explain this part about intuitions and utilitarianism when we close out. And so Philippa Foot's trolley problem goes like this. So again, Philippa Foot was the developer of the trolley problem, and it might help to remember that Philippa Foot is a so-called virtue ethicist. And so what she's doing by developing the trolley problem is to point out the problem that we have in terms of intuitions with regard to problems of utilitarianism. So the reason why she develops the trolley problem is to critique utilitarianism and to draw our focus on intuitions, which is important for non-consequentialist theories like virtue ethics. And that's why she develops the trolley problem. But Andrade is making use of the trolley problems to focus on problems with intuitions and also to favor utilitarian responses to questions of non-maleficence, and likewise, as we pointed out, to call into question issues of non-maleficence. So going back to Philippa Foot's trolley problem, which goes like this. So a presumably out-of-control trolley is rolling down the tracks, and the driver has the option of diverting the trolley, and diverting the trolley one of two directions. And the one track has one person tied onto it, and another track has 5 people tied onto it. So the driver has the choice to divert the trolley, and Foote proposes that the driver should ethically opt for killing the one person on the track to save 5. And that is by way of utilitarian ethics. So she's calling into question our intuition there. And so she also expressed that in such cases, these points are not always clear in terms of our previous example with the terminally ill patients who needed the transplant from the one healthy person. See, so the one healthy person, should we sacrifice the life of the one healthy person to help the terminally ill, the 5 terminally ill patients? Usually we're going to say no. So that's to call into question our intuition, our utilitarian intuition, that it's always just a numbers game, okay? So yet she disagreed that the 2 cases are the same, whereby the difference rested on the notion of negative duties versus positive duties. So Philippa Foote has this notion of negative duties versus positive duties. So we have duties not to do certain things, i.e. negative duties, and duties to do certain things, i.e. positive duties. And so for Foote, it is more ethically and virtually apparent that we should favor negative duties of avoiding harm to a single person to save 5. So basically, non-maleficence supersedes autonomy, even if the patient were to consent. And interestingly enough, the problem rests on the wrongness of doing something or killing, whereby letting 5 people die is the lesser evil and therefore the best ethical choice for Foote in the case of the problem of killing the healthy person to harvest their organs for the terminally ill 5 people, okay? So in contrast with the trolley problem, the action of diverting is both actively killing either 1 or 5. So given the gut-wrenching decision that the driver would have to kill anyone at all must rest on killing the 1, given that the 5 will be killed. So with organ transplant thought experiment shows that the duty of non-maleficence supersedes killing and the duty of action, whereby the classic trolley problem is that actually killing 1 person, given that the trolley is out of control in the first place. So thereby, to kill 1 is better than killing 5, and also not killing 1 and letting 5 die is better, depending on how it is that you consider the difference between the thought experiments and then also considering the notion of negative duties in relation to positive duties. And so there also is for Andrade the highlight with the philosopher James Rachels. So James Rachels was born in 1941, passes away in 2003, and Rachels thinks otherwise to Foote's analysis. And so hereby with Rachel's thought experiment, a woman, so again, we have another thought experiment, a woman poisons her uncle's coffee because she wants him dead for some reason. And oddly enough, another woman also wants him dead, yet is in a position to notice that he's already been poisoned by the first lady. And so is it best to simply let him die without administering an antidote that she has in her pocket for the second lady? And so this thought experiment is intended to show that there is not a difference between passively letting die and actively poisoning the uncle. So in either case, the poisoning and actively letting die are equally egregious according to Rachel's. So that shows that problem of the difference between passive duties and positive duties. So Andrade clearly agrees that with Rachel's hypothesis that either direction, regardless of the difference between positive and negative duties, the difference is not in favor of the principle of non-maleficence, especially in the case of euthanasia, where the difference rests on the ethical difference between passive euthanasia and active euthanasia, i.e. letting die versus actively bringing about death. So what he's proposing is that letting die in the case of passive euthanasia is not necessarily any better than actively bringing about the death. So he was famous for this distinction with regard to euthanasia. And so this is where we also draw the line, and that is better to let die than to actively bring about death, to actively kill a patient than or to simply let them die. It's hard to say which is worse given Rachel's thought experiment, okay? And so according to Andrade, medical ethicists agree with this and therefore support the notion and primacy of non-maleficence. So yet, as we just pointed out, Rachel's poisoned uncle example is a way to prove this otherwise. And so murdering and letting die are not the same thing, but yet there is an interesting problem when we think of Rachel's thought experiment. That is there really that much of a difference is the question, right? And so this, so Andrade then seems to err with this intuition. So then we have the second trolley problem, okay? So then in terms of the extending on the thought experiment of the trolley problem, there is a variant of the trolley problem by way of Judith Jarvis Thomson. I don't have her dates, I should have wrote her dates down, but Judith Jarvis Thomson is probably more famous for her points on her pro-choice position on abortion, but she actually had some weigh-in here in terms of the trolley problem. And so this time the setup is more or less the same as Foote's trolley problem, whereby the exception is now someone has control of a lever. So this is usually how we think of the trolley problem, is that there's someone with a lever that diverts the out of control problem to divert it from killing 5 to then to killing 5 to then versus killing 5 to then only kill 1. So the proposal then is that according to utilitarian ethics, one should only, it's better to kill 1 than kill 5. So the difference then is that there is the person's responsibility to divert the out of control trolley, and technically to hit the 5 is worse than hitting the one person, the single person. So this stands in contrast to our intuitions with the transplant example, whereby in this case, most people side with the lever puller's decision to save 5 by rerouting the trolley to hit the single person, right? And so this seems right, and it obviates then the non-maleficence principle. So then the person is obviating the non-maleficence principle there. And so with the transplant case, the problem rests on killing 1 as a means to the life of 5, whereby with the Thomson's trolley problem or scenario, the single person on the track is not getting used as a means to an end. And this, to Andrade, is really an affirmation of the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant's second version of the categorical imperative, And the second version of the categorical imperative is always treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time an end. So that's the second version of the categorical imperative. And so this is a way to express Kant's deontology. And so his principle of duty is otherwise known as deontology, is to not use another person as a means to someone else's end. And importantly, the consequences, thereof are the problem. So then there stands for a utilitarian in terms of consequentialist theory, whereby the value of the action rests on the consequences. So in other words, Kant was non-consequentialist, so we're looking more at the value of intent, whereas as Andrade points out, and we know through studying utilitarianism, that the value of the action is then more important for a utilitarian on the consequences, because that can be empirically traced. And so, in other words, for a utilitarian, there is more happiness to be brought about for the greatest amount of people, and in terms of the consequences, rather than resting the value on the intuition, as we do with Kant's theory of duty or Kant's deontology. So then the difference is with the consequentialist utilitarian, who implies that the sacrifice of the one person is worth the benefit of the many, whereby with Kant's deontology, he does not allow for this ethical permissibility to kill a singular person, because our duty is our duty superseded non-maleficence principle, in the sense that we're thinking of the importance of our intuition, i.e., the harm done to someone must never be the means to achieve someone else's end, as in the case of saving the 5 people. Okay, so Andrade then brings in a timely example of vaccines, whereby the pharmaceutical developers of vaccines accept that a certain percentage of that there's a certain percentage of risk to the potential health of a small percentage of people, hopefully, and perhaps the threat of this smaller percentage of people could also be death. And so vaccinators then face this dilemma. And so do we harm the few versus administering the vaccine to no one versus, and so in other words, should we take no risk at all and versus taking some risk and benefiting the larger amount of people? And that's usually what we do there in terms of utilitarian strategy. And so the principle of non-maleficence then is called into question, that we might look at the smaller percentage of people who are harmed by the vaccine is worth the value of helping the most amount of people. So then we have the 3rd, 4th, and 5th trolley cases, whereby we're taken to St. Thomas Aquinas. So St. Thomas Aquinas is a medieval Christian philosopher, and he's famous for his doctrine of double effect, which was developed under his so-called just war theory. Just war theory is a way to look at a justification for harms done in war, harms committed in war. And so he, as a Christian philosopher and natural law theorist, has to go through the difficult task of figuring out how to justify harms in war. And so this also obviously has application to medical ethics. And so, for example, an action might have a double effect, whereby there is a bad effect and a good effect. And so, where with any particular tactic. So first, your action must be brought about only in certain conditions, whereby your action should always be aimed toward moral goodness and or be neutral in terms of the intent. And so secondly, the bad effect must not be a means to a good effect. In other words, the intent must not be bad, but only foreseen. So in other words, the intent should not be bad, but only foreseen, okay? And then so third, the motive must always be to achieve the good effect. So with Aquinas's natural law theory, he is an advocate of intending goodness in all situations. And so with this principle of double effect, or doctrine of double effect, we have some provisions whereby we have actions that, with the idea that we must aim for good, and so the bad effect must always be a means to the good effect, but the intent must not be bad to begin with. And so the motive also must always be to achieve the good effect. And then fourth, the good effect must be greater than the bad effect. So these are ways of rationally understanding how it is that we could justify negative actions in wartime. And as we pointed out, Andrade is seeing this as a way, having application to bioethics. And so with the vaccination example, the vaccinator does not intend to kill people, and even if this is to harm, if the action then is to harm people, and if that harm is foreseen, it is not the intended purpose, right? Whereby the principle of non-maleficence is bypassed and deprioritized. Okay, and then so this leads us to the next variation of the trolley problem, or the third variation of the trolley problem, whereby an out-of-control trolley is headed down the track and about to hit 5 people tied to the track, and a man is on the bridge over the track, located somewhere between the point whereby the trolley's about to hit 5 people, and someone has helplessly tied 5 people to the tracks. So the option is to push the man off the bridge to somehow buffer the train and stop the train from hitting the 5 people. So a proponent of Aquinas's doctrine of double effect would see this as a challenge to, in the sense that I deliberately intended the death to ensure the well-being for the 5 people as a good effect. So in other words, saving the 5 people is then a question of bringing about the benefit for the 5 people, and so pushing the man off the bridge, we're calling into question the double effect, because I intended to hurt the man in order to save the 5. Okay, so take for example the case of a pregnant lady with uterine cancer, whereby the doctor knows that the fetus will survive the operation, will not survive the operation, yet although the death of the fetus is not intended, the operation is still a violation of the Catholic position on pro-life, whereby the harm to the fetus must not be intended but only foreseen. So, but yet this is not just foreseen, and so Andrade implies that it stands that the mother's life should be saved and that the fetus should be then aborted by default, And so given that the fetus is not directly targeted. So a patient who is terminally ill, so then we go to a patient who is terminally ill and asks for morphine. This time the effects of the morphine kill the patient. So the question is this euthanasia? Not quite. So if the patient was in fact about to die, the death from the morphine is a side effect and not looked at as immediately brought about by the doctor. So for instance, if they were in hospice care, for instance. And so consider the example offered by the medical ethicist Tony Hope. So a truck is on fire and the driver is trapped inside and nearly facing death, and his buddy is helplessly standing outside the truck, and the driver is at least able to plead with his friend to shoot him, given that the driver knows that his buddy has a gun, and Hope argues that the friend should shoot the driver to save him from burning alive. So such an intentional act under the doctrine of double effect is violated, given that the shooting the driver should be considered unethical, given that the harm is intentional. And the only good is death. And the good effect is not necessarily the greater of the bad effect. And so, due to the fact that the driver is intentionally harmed. And so Andrade's suggestion is that the doctrine of double effect shouldn't stand in the way of the mercy killing. So in other words, the harm still should be brought about. And so again, he's calling into question the always observing non-maleficence, okay? I.e. the principle of non-maleficence should be put aside in such scenarios. And so if J.J. Thomson had, and so we could then turn to another thought experiment or another trolley problem of J.J. Thomson's. So perhaps as a critique of the doctrine of double effect. So this time there is a looping track whereby a single man is tied on the looping track in a position to divert the trolley onto the loop to save the lives of the 5 people. Sorry, one is in a position to divert the track onto the loop where the man is tied to save the lives of the 5 people. And so question is, should one direct the trolley to hit the man whose body will stop the trolley? So Andrade suggests that usually people who, that there are people who are fewer who are thinking that the trolley should hit the man in the loop to save the 5 others. And so, in other words, the question is there people who object to throwing the man off the bridge might feel better to divert the trolley to hit the one man and save the 5. So, in other words, the distinction being that the trolley is out of control in the first place with the looped track version, and pushing the man seems more like direct killing. And so, in other words, with the 4th trolley problem, the trolley on the loop, so diverting the trolley onto the loop to kill the single man is an intentional killing brought about to benefit the 5. So the question is, how is it that we are thinking of this direct killing versus intending to save the 5? So in other words, the man's life is a means to a beneficial end, which supports a utilitarian value, whereby the means support the end of bringing about the happiness for the 5 people who are saved a certain death. In other words, the doctrine of double effect cannot always be observed, and hence another challenge to the principle of non-maleficence. And so, in other words, in terms of medical ethics, harm can be done, even if it is intentional. And so there's also a 5th trolley problem to highlight. And now we're thinking of the difference with the 3rd and 4th trolley problems, where pushing the man off the bridge seems morally dreadful, as opposed to merely diverting the trolley, as in the 4th trolley problem. So I guess the idea is that people are more averse to pushing the man off the bridge as opposed to diverting the trolley in the case of the looped trolley problem. And so the 5th problem seems to be a way to address this distinction. Say now we're back to the 3rd trolley problem on the bridge, and the difference being that instead of pushing the man off the bridge, we're left with the question of pulling a lever to release a trap door where a man will fall onto the track to buffer the train from hitting the 5 people who are, as can be predicted, helplessly tied to the track. And so ostensibly this is to isolate the difference between pushing the man as opposed to pulling a lever. Andrade specifies in these cases whereby euthanasia, Andrade specifies that in cases of euthanasia, such a difference is also a way to draw a distinction whereby the difference between assisting a death versus actively bringing about, which seems to be the lesser of 2 evils for most people, yet both options are intentional and foreseen and obviate the non-maleficence principle, as well as Aquinas's doctrine of double effect. And so Andrade then suggests that the trapdoor trolley problem should be used in medical ethics as a way of helping medical professionals in deciding physician-assisted suicide cases. And so the conclusion for Andrade is, do intentions really matter? Again, when we're looking at St. Thomas Aquinas and Immanuel Kant, we're looking at the importance they're placing on intuitions, but yet with utilitarians, we're looking more at the value of consequences and less on intuitions. And so it's interesting to note that Andrade concludes the essay mostly in favor of utilitarianism. And so he rests this on the grounds that for a utilitarian, in contrast to what we pointed out at the opening of the lecture, that intentions are not as important in our decision-making in critical situations, and to the degree that what matters most for a utilitarian is the way in which quantities of people are helped and saved. And so this then takes our moral value due to the empirical traceability of knowing that numbers of people are then saved, and to call into question intuitions that are not as reliable as clear as the rational choices made in terms of valuing the most amount of people that is empirically evident and important for a utilitarian. So as Andrade points out, utilitarians do not seem to have much patience with the primacy of non-maleficence. So he's calling into question principle of non-maleficence, because this principle is possibly a way that people are not working toward the greater good for the most amount of people, because he is a utilitarian. So Thank you, and we'll talk more about this in class, and see you later.